The soldier from the Turkish squad climbed the mountain, feeling the strain of carrying the heavy weapons. His exhausted legs almost slipped, making him look down at the ground. He barely noticed that just above the Kurd was waiting behind the rocks. The man lying in wait stood up and the two stared at each other for a split second. He hesitated, surprised, then watched as the other's finger closed around the trigger of the K, greeting the Turks' arrival at the peak. With the heavy gift, which poured out in automatic fire from the smoking barrel. No sooner had one life faded away, the Kurd turned, taking from the other soldier the chance for another breath on the arduous climb. The fighter hid again among the rocks to reload. There were more enemies down below and he needed to face them. He knew he was surrounded and the battle wouldn't end anytime soon. Human beings learn from an early age to draw lines on the ground. Over time, the idea of drawing imaginary lines on the same land where he lived also arises, and he grows fond of the thin lines that illustrate what he calls home or nation. Marking boundaries becomes a source of pride and also of violence. All kinds of reasons lead to hatred that climbs a steep mountain until it reaches the peak of war. Entire peoples are swept up in the climb and by the avalanche that develops as a result of the conflicts. The reasons for the beginning may vary and be forgotten over time, but the consequences remain. Lands lost by ancestors bring death to descendants in conflict. Borders drawn by powerful men who don't care about those living between the imaginary lines become a reason for real bloodshed. Don't ask if the imaginary lines have no value. They are part of the definition of a people. Part of an identity that is shaped by language, culture, their rights, their freedom. Maybe the better question is about the boundaries involved in these disputes. For those who are far away, well protected within the safety of their own borders, they often ask the wrong questions about why Turks, Kurds and Syrians, Iraqis and Yazidis and other people still redden the land they live on with their lives. The Kurds have a long history in lands that are now declared as part of Syria, Iran, Iraq and Turkey. All attempts to become an independent state failed even in the 20th century. After World War I, they were promised defined lands. The Treaty of Sèvres dissolved the Ottoman Empire and proposed the creation of an autonomous Turkish government. The promise was as empty as drawing lines in the desert sand. The newly formed Turkish government opposed it, and the lines drawn by men scattered the Kurds across 4 countries. So many peoples placed within these borders would become involved in later conflicts. Kurdistan would be a land without borders, spread within lines that would bring death and violence to everyone inside those boundaries. The escalation to the peak of the war would be completed in the 1980s. From then on, the Kurds' struggles intensified. Weapons became the main way to demand change. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, announced the beginning of the insurgency in 1984. The conflicts grew, but the Turkish government, supported by powerful Kurdish landowners, reacted. The PKK would become one of the most famous and most controversial representatives of the Kurds in the world. Mainly due to its conflicts with Turkey, the party would take on various forms over the years, starting with an unstructured policy until the leader Abdullah Öcalan took control. There were accusations that many of its members had been murdered to eliminate internal disputes in the name of unity. Öcalan would deny all the accusations and become the main leader on behalf of the Kurds, fighting against the rules of the Turkish government. Turkey would ban any manifestation of Kurdish culture until 1991, arresting anyone who sang, spoke or published in the Kurdish language. The 1990s were a tumultuous period. More than 3,000 Kurdish villages were destroyed in Turkey when they refused to cooperate with the government. Many of the inhabitants took refuge in the mountains. Others went to Iraq, where their people had been massacred years earlier by Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons. Other villages agreed and began to be attacked by those who had been expelled. Many times there were even civilian casualties. The PKK would attack collaborators of the Turkish government, often not sparing non-military targets in many cases, according to numerous accusations. These actions would cloak the party in the mantle of terrorism. The deaths of civilians and pressure from the Turkish government would lead to international cooperation for the arrest of Abdullah Öcalan in 1999. This would not reduce the conflicts despite the ceasefire agreements. Fingers on both sides would always be on the triggers, and any distraction would lead to bloodshed. Turkey would fight the PKK even outside its borders. Its F-16 soared through the air, pursuing precise targets. Many times the Kurds were caught off guard by these war machines in the worst possible way. A meeting in the Kandil Mountains was brutally cut short, leaving 33 leaders dead. In an airstrike. Among them were men who managed the Sinjar region, which would later play a key role in the Kurds' battles under the command of the slain leader's replacement, Ismail Osnain. Syria burned with uprisings during the Arab Spring in 2012. The local Kurds established autonomous territories under the protection of the People's Protection Units, the YPG. These actions led the PKK to adopt a dangerous strategy in Turkey: war. The military launched a campaign in the city of Sendinli, cutting off communication with Iraq and Iran. Heavy weaponry was placed on the roads to start a series of ambushes against the forces that would come to liberate the region. The Turks realized the trap. Their F-16s took off again. The wings that cut through the wind would cut through the people's audacity. The PKK tried to challenge the Turkish government to a direct confrontation like that. The AGM-65 Maverick missiles with a 57 Ku warhead descended toward the ground, mixing the lives and equipment of the Kurds with fire. Any PKK group that was found was engaged from a distance. The bases were easy targets. The ONTAS ATGMs were set up by forward teams in the mountains. The range of up to 4 km was a huge advantage to avoid the trap. The following years would see attempts at peace. Between 2012 and 2015, the PKK and Turkey would negotiate. But peace was like a silk dress that couldn't withstand the roughness of contact with hatred. Party leaders were assassinated in Paris, and bombings against the Ministry of Justice in Ankara began to tear apart the fragile seams of the agreement. The Kurds had already learned the lesson well. Direct confrontation would be avoided. They began to ambush enemy forces on the roads. Military trucks traveling alone became targets. The vehicles slowed down at the curves, triggering the first shots. The driver, having been hit, lost control, and the fighters advanced against the Kurds. Gunfire flashed incessantly, suppressing any attempt at defense. The transport offered no protection against any of the projectiles, serving only as a tomb for the Turkish soldiers. The members of the PKK returned to the mountains right after the lightning attack. The Turkish army knew where they were. They needed to take revenge for the problems caused. They sent their soldiers to attack the hideouts in the asylum. The soldiers needed to make a steep climb to face a cunning enemy. Entrenched, the opposing fighters knew how to wait. Two of them, in particular, were aware that they were surrounded by the small squad advancing up the mountain. From behind the rocks, Okudo rose from his ambush, unleashing death multiple times at the first Turk. The second one fell just as quickly. With the ammunition lodging in his side, the grenade flew right after toward the enemies sheltered behind the rocks below. Shots echoed through the mountain as the Kurd reloaded his rifle to feed the earth with more blood. He left cover to look for more targets, his eyes already familiar with the terrain. The sight found another Turk lurking in the brush, letting the 5.45 ammo fly to raise dust and blood. He told his companion that the job wasn't done yet. The two started to finish the job with more shots flying and more blood spilling over the rocks. More explosives flew to meet the Turks. Just ahead, the comrade hid behind the rocks without the same boldness. The first man then took his place as the two flanked the last Turk, throwing at him the ammunition that would take away his last breath. The battle ended only with the bodies of the Turkish soldiers on the ground. To the victors, the spoils of that day. The Kurd carried the machine gun and the helmet of the fallen men, obtaining tools to continue protecting that high position which gave him so much power over his enemies. The Turks had advanced weapons and trained troops. However, when facing the Kurds, they struggled with the difficulty of finding the guerrillas in the rough terrain that made up the battlefields. The conflicts would still continue, but during this period, the Kurds would face another enemy. Part of the Kurdish nation was in Iraq, where they gained rights and independence. The Kurdish Peshmerga troops stood alongside the Iraqi army to face the evil that fed on the hatred sown in the desert and spread across the sands. The Islamic State, Daesh, was growing rapidly amid the chaos. It had been fueled by the disaster caused by the Americans in Iraq. The Kurds still accused Turkey of, at one point, having fed the dragon that consumed with fire anyone who did not submit to its vision of Islam. Turkey accused the Kurds of often using Daesh's practices, including using children as soldiers. Among those who refused to submit to the Islam of the Islamic State were the Yazidis, a people whose beliefs differ from the religion of Muhammad. They believe in God who created the world and left its command to his first emanation, Melektos. For many, the Yazidis' peacock-shaped deity was considered a demon. For the Islamic State, this was the reason for relentless persecution. Entire villages were destroyed, with the entire male population succumbing to the black and white flag's thirst for blood. Children were turned into soldiers. The fate of the women was an endless hell in the hands of men who did not recognize the value of life or the freedom of those who thought differently. The Peshmerga and the Iraqi army had retreated from the north in 2014, giving even more opportunity for the Yazidis to be hunted. All they could do was run to Mount Sinjar. Thousands took refuge there, waiting for any kind of help, while ISIS began to do its work. Trapped without water and food, the refugees saw more than 200 children die in their arms, struck down by heat, hunger, and thirst. The extremists' gunfire was another scourge that broke the lifeline of the Yazidis. American and Iraqi forces began providing aid, sending food and water to the mountains. Helicopters tried to rescue the refugees. The PKK and the YPJ marched under the command of the Kurdish provincial leader Ismail Ozdem. The same guerrilla tactics used against the Turks were also part of the battles. Islamic State fuel tankers were targeted. Guided missiles began their journeys to destroy the enemy's fuel supplies. The snipers hid in the mountains to exact an almost silent revenge on the evil in the desert. The following forces advanced to claim the souls of the Islamic State. Men ran alongside comrades who probably wouldn't be among them by nightfall. The gunshots amid the scant protection of the trees were a clear terror for everyone brandishing weapons. They crouched down together, only to rise again when the next order came. They continued toward the enemies. Men and women fought together in the battles. The YPJ, the women's units, were part of what made ISIS afraid. Their soldiers never wanted to fall victim to the female fighters who smiled during roadside ambushes, simply waiting for the enemies to pass by. The trigger pulled by slender, delicate fingers brought death with the same determination and precision as the rough fingers of men. Islamic State soldiers fell on the dirt roads, becoming victims of those whose lives they sought to turn into hell. Daesh fought back. Even surrounded by the PKK, YPJ, and the Peshmerga who were arriving further south, they used a 73mm TGL for precise shots against the Kurdish bases. The successive explosions destroyed the old buildings. The men who were forced to flee had to ready themselves at new bases. That was a war of a different kind of ferocity. It was personal and intense hatred that drew men against each other. And it was in the prayers chanted with raised hands. The ATGMs flew toward the bases to blow up enemies. But it was just one of the weapons whose distance did not convey the reality of what was happening in the hearts hardened in the desert. The bombings were certainly terrifying in an undeniable way. But the personal horror of close combat was what best expressed the feeling that boiled in the blood of those men. The desperate rush to kill allowed the groans of the enemies to wash over their ears with the hateful pleasure of eliminating an opponent in the midst of the gunfire. The AKs vibrated with the same frequency as the war cries and the feelings. Less than a meter apart from each other, the fighters fired rounds that kicked up dust. When the flag of the Islamic State was raised at one of the bases, the relatives and friends of any Kurd could only expect the worst. Daesh gathered its men again for prayer. The orders were given before they got into improvised vehicles to start a race across the sands. The ammunition outpaced the cars as it was fired toward the small bases set up by the Kurds and Iraqis. They fired back, turning many of those attacks into a festival of martyrs. The violence of the Islamic State catalyzed the union of many groups. Soldiers trained by the Americans and the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, joined the battle. The Kurds allied themselves with men who received support from Apache helicopters that fired at the extremists inside the occupied cities. The advances were made with whatever was available. Heavy construction machinery was used as protection for men firing rifles and RPGs. The battles were successful. So many forces working together managed to create escape routes for the Yazidis. The connection between the fronts allowed the Peshmerga forces to become dominant once again in Sinjar. The PKK's Kurdish fighters celebrated, but the fighting was still far from over. Syria and Iraq would become the main stages for the battles between Turkey and the Kurds. The disagreements would reach a new level that would please only death and anyone who traded weapons with either side. The Turks knew where the Kurds were hiding, but often had trouble reaching them. A mere lapse was enough for Turkey's technology to pay the Kurds a deadly visit. Ismail Ozdem, who took part in the battle against the Islamic State, was considered a terrorist in Turkey. He had already been arrested in Germany for the same reason, being one of the influential figures of the PKK. In 2018, he went to attend a memorial for the Yazidi massacre in Sinjar, the very massacre he had helped stop. Without knowing it, his phone was tracked and his movements were followed by a drone. As soon as permission was granted by the Iraqi government, the F-16 got into position, ready to strike there. The first bomb fell on the armored car, but it didn't have the expected effect. The driver sped up, trying to escape. However, Ismail was a marked soul, with nowhere to hide from the death lurking among the clouds. The scythe came down on the Kurdish leader, this time ending his existence. The memorial for Ismail Ozdem hadn't even been held yet. Turkey continued to hunt its adversaries in the mountains, who were much harder to locate. Information about hiding places was passed among the commandos, who devised strategies to eliminate the guerrillas. Helicopters flew over the mountains, clearing the way for the soldiers. They circled over the Kurds' heads, preparing to drop more than just wind on the enemies. The 7.62 2mm minigun spun its 6 barrels rapidly against the mountain. If it didn't get the job done, the M249 grenade launcher finished the job. The helicopters did their best, but they were vulnerable to attacks from the Kurds. The 9K-38 Igla had a range of several kilometers. The warhead of over 1 kilogram was enough for a fatal strike against the Cobra helicopter, causing the death of both crew members. This forced the soldiers to adopt a second strategy. They climbed the mountains for several kilometers and set the ATGMs in position. The next task was to make the missiles thunder between the rocks. The nearest squad approached the Kurdish tunnels. A well-aimed RPG was used to drive the guerrillas away from the entrances. With the sniper observing, the soldiers began their cautious advance toward the deadly encounters. The ballistic shield and the pistol cleared the way. In the absence of the Kurds at the entrances, the men prepared the grenades. The explosion could expand in only 2 directions. The Turks waited safely. On the other side, the Kurds felt their eardrums burst from the blast wave inside the tunnels. The violent battles always ended with lives lost in the darkness. The gunshots thundered in their ears, in an environment dimly lit only by the flame of death coming out of the barrels. In the end, the Turks celebrated gaining another position, showing off the arsenal they had captured, but the guerrillas appeared again. The mountains were too vast a stronghold to be fully conquered. The fighting began with fierce ambushes in the mountains. They waited for the first patrol before rushing at the enemy. The violence of the advance left the soldiers in shock, taking another Turkish life in the mountains. Then the Kurds followed the patrolmen's footsteps to find out where the other enemies were. The steep climb was not a problem. A few guerrillas, used to the rocks, climbed while throwing grenades at the enemy positions. The explosions rattled the soldiers. This, combined with the speed of the Kurds, made defense almost impossible. A single Turk tried to defend himself. However, he wasn't fast enough. The Kurd ducked down for cover. Even wounded, he returned to the fight with a speed that confused the Turks. The confusion of attacks from so many directions and the explosions fooled the enemy enough to leave him exposed. He fell to the opponent, who failed to kill him at the last moment. His comrades tried to mount a defense, but it was useless. A grenade flew at the pair, followed by AK shots. The peak belonged to the Kurds. From there, they became a scourge. The patrols that carelessly traveled along the road became easy targets in the war. The tanks were not safe from ATGMs either, even when they were camouflaged. Technology was the Turkish answer. The Baykar TB2 took flight. It was 6 meters long and had a 12-meter wingspan, searching for targets at over 130 kilometers H. Its lenses found the positions atop the peaks and began killing men and women. The MAMC guided bombs had a range of up to 8 kilometers. Terror descended on the positions, causing the mountains to change hands once again, even if only for a moment. Those small changes of control were nothing in the long existence of those peaks, which had become so accustomed to absorbing human blood. The disputes between the Kurds and the Turks dragged on without any resolution. The history, so intricate with so many deaths of fighters and civilians, was a painful stain on the culture of both peoples. The intricate hatred between the nations has flourished for years. Once its roots manage to cling to the stones of the mountains, it becomes endemic and spreads its seeds throughout all seasons. Many believe they have the cure for the plague that was planted, but it's hard to truly test which medicine works. Hatred is resilient, and the problems it causes often make people get distracted by trading accusations about who planted the plague instead of focusing on who should be responsible for curing it. But it's never easy. It's only easy for those who judge from afar in the safety of their homes.